video, I want to talk about user input. So up to this point, we've talked about variables, how to declare and initialize them, and even how to manipulate them with operations and the like. But if we wanted to change the output of our code, we'd have to go back into our program and we'd have to change those variables manually, which is very tedious. It's not effective nor efficient. So instead, it would be a lot more useful if we can get the kind of input the user wants. We can take some sort of user inputs and we can do some type of operation with that input. For example, if I wanted to add two numbers, instead of having to go back and edit the two variables every time I want to change the output, I can ask the user, what two numbers do you want? And they'll enter two numbers, such as 3 and 5. And then we can output the answer, which is 8. So let's talk about how we would go about getting user input. So I've already gone and created an input class. And in order to use input, we're going to use something called the scanner class. And this is a class already made by Java. It's in the Java library. Now, in order to use it, we need to import it. And to import it, we go outside of our class, right even before we declare our class over here. At the very top of our program, we type import. And then we do the library name, which is Java. And then we put a dot. And then we put the package name, which is util. And then we put another dot. And now we put the class name, which is scanner, with a capital S. And then we put a semicolon. Now, this, if you remember back in the first video on talking about displaying input and output, where I briefly mentioned the organization system. And this is why. Anytime you want to import a class inside the Java library, or any other library for that matter, you have to first indicate the library, and then the package, and then the class name. And this is how you get to use all these different useful classes in the Java library. Now let's say we wanted to use more than one class in the util package. Let's say we had a lot of classes that we were using. We can use this wildcard, which is an asterisk. And what this basically means is I want you to import every single class inside this package. So that's just a quick way of doing it if you're going to be using a lot of them. But for now, I'm just going to import scanner. After we import scanner, we now need to create a scanner object. Now we'll talk more about objects in the next video, but for now we're just going to create an object in order to use it. So the declaration is very similar to a variable. We start with the class name, scanner, and then an identifier. Same rules for the identifiers as variables. Commonly used is scan. So scanner scan equals. Now this is where it gets different. We type in new scanner, open up a pair of parentheses, and inside those parentheses we type system.in, capital S. So we'll talk more about what this does in the next video, but for now you can think of it as first declaring your object, and then you're saying I want a new scanner class, right? I want to use a new scanner class, and then I want the type of input. Inside these parentheses is saying where do you want to get your input from. So because there's different options, you can get your input from a file or some other type of document, right? But no, we want to get our input from the system.in, right? We want to get the user input. So this is in essence just saying I want you to create a scanner object for me to get user input. So now we've created a scanner object. How do we get our user input? The way we get user input is using something called methods. So the scanner class has methods, and this is what makes objects different than variables at a fundamental level, is its ability to have methods. And methods are basically like functions, some type of operation that you can do. So if you notice, first we have our method, what our method is called, and then here we have a description of the method. So let's first briefly talk about the method names itself. So first we have the public. Don't need to worry about what this public means. It just means like you can use the method. And then next we have some type of data type, right? And this is called the return type, which means that your method, this method is going to give you some type of value. And in order to use that value, you usually need to store it inside a variable. So if you want to store this type of variable, what kind of data type do you need to store it? And that's what this return type is. So for example, this method, which is called nextLine, if I want to store the value given to me by this method, I would have to store it in a string variable or a string object. And then this very last part over here is the name of the method itself. So next, next line, next byte, next short, next int. And basically, it's what it sounds like. Next double will give you a double. Next long will give you a long. Next int will give you an integer. And next line will give you the entire line. Now, the way we call our method is first we use our identifier that we gave to our object. So in our program, we gave the identifier name scan. So we're going to use scan as our identifier name. Then we use this dot, right? And this dot means that I want to use a method or I want to access something from this object. And then after this dot, we put in the method name. For example, next line. And then after that, we have to put these parentheses. Even if nothing goes inside these parentheses, you have to put the parentheses. And parentheses indicates you're dealing with a method. So scan.nextLine will get the input for the next line. So it will take a line of input from the user and it will store it as a string. So if we go back to our program, let's try doing scan.nextLine. If I compile and I run it, we now see that it's waiting for my input. So I can type in input such as Java. And so now we gave it some input. But now I want to do something with that input. How? Well, I never stored it in a variable, so it's just basically lost, right? It's like I can't do anything with this if I don't store it. So I'm going to store it in a string, right? So I'm going to create a string, and I'm going to store it in, and I'm going to make it equal to scan.nextLine. So it's going to get the user input, and then it's going to store this value inside the string object. And then if I want, I can do an integer, scan.nextInt. And I can do a double, which is scan.nextDouble. Now these are the three most common ones we'll be using. You can use next byte, next short, which returns byte and short respectively. But these are the most common ones you'll be using for home programming. So if I compile this, first I'll get an input. I'll take some type of input, so Java, and then you can have numbers too, whatever you want for text. And then the next one is an integer, so I'll type in an integer, and the last one is a double, so I can type in some type of double. Now, something to be careful about is, for example, string can take in any type of input because it's a string. But for integer, you have to make sure you enter an integer. For example, if I type in 89.0, it's going to say input mismatch exception, which means it was expecting an int, but I gave it a double instead. So that's something you should be careful about when taking user input. So after we have our user input, now we can perform actions with these input. So I can, for example, print out the string name, and then maybe I can also print out the multiplication of these two numbers. So system.out.println num times num2. And now if I compile and I run this program, first it will ask us for some type of text, Java, and next it will ask, we need to input two numbers, so 8.8, sorry, we need an integer and then the double. So it will output Java and then it'll output the multiplication. Now when it comes to asking for input, it's always useful to first print out what kind of input they're expecting. So we can say enter a piece of text, and then we'll have the scan.nextLine after that. So now the user knows to enter a string. Next we can say enter an integer, and now the user knows to enter an integer. And finally, we can say enter a double, and now the user knows to enter a double. And if we run this program now we know what kind of input we're looking for. So I know I want a piece of text. Now I know I want an integer. Now I know I want a double. So this is essentially the way we get user input from the user. And this really allows us to take our programming to the next level, because now instead what we can do is, instead of having to go into our program and change variables, we can get the user input and then output the kind of information we need. And that way we don't have to keep going back and changing our program. Now the last thing I want to say is that we can declare the string first and then initialize it later. What do I mean by that? So I can create a string str up here, just declare it like that, and then down here I can just initialize it, just like how you would do it with a normal variable, right? And there might sometimes be reasons you need to do this. I don't have one in the top of my mind now, but if it's something you want to have as an option, let's say you want to use these 3 different variables, right? So you can declare them all at once up top. So string str, let's say name and date of birth, for example. You can declare all of these, and then you can just have the inputs. You can just use them later on and assign them to the scan.nextLine, scan.nextInt, or scan.nextDouble as needed. So that is really all there is to it for getting inputs. For practice, ask the user for 2 numbers, whether integers or double, that's up to you. And print out the 5 different operations. So addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, and modulo. And when you print out that information, specify which operation it is. So for example, if I enter 7 and 8, for addition, print out 7 plus 8 equals, and then print out the answer. And then 7 minus 8 equals, and then 7 times 8 equals, and so on and so forth. So that's a good way to practice user input. And try different things with scan.nextLine. So ask the user for their name, for example, and output their name. And just get yourself familiar with input, because input is going to be used throughout most of your programs. It's really what gives you more versatility in your programming. That is it. Thank you, and I will see you next time.